All right, good morning. Here we go, Cornerstone. Thanks to those of us who are watching online, and for those of us who are in the room, I love it. We've been talking about heaven for a few weeks. Pastor Lynn asked me to teach on this topic, how do you get to heaven? Which is a cool question. What would you say if someone came up to you and said that? It's like every evangelist's dream. How do you get to heaven? And then they bump into you and your Bible hits the ground and opens to John 3:16. You're like, let me show you the way of salvation, you sinner. What would you say though, and I know that not everybody who comes to church is a professing Christian. That's okay, we're glad that you're here. If you are a Christian, what would you say to that question? Most Christians would take the person to John 3:16, right? That's like the most iconic verse in the Bible. Like if the Bible was an album, this would be like the #1 hit. It's like the most referenced, like you guys like In-N-Out Burger, right? If there was no God, In-N-Out would be my religion. And on the bottom of their cups, they have written John 3:16. Which is cool. So while you're like guzzling down Coca-Cola and destroying your body, you can not be seeing the verse. Millions and millions and millions of cups have gone out with this verse kind of hidden there on the bottom. There's some other ones on some different of their products. Same thing with Forever 21, which is a store for people who are trying to be younger. On the bottom of their bags, it says John 3:16. Why is that? Because someone who works at these companies, presumably the person who is in charge, have been impacted by this verse and this content so much that they want to push this content out to the world. If you don't know the verse says, God loved the world so much that he gave his only son that anyone who believed in him would never die, but would live forever. That's the verse. One guy kind of got famous utilizing this verse. Do you remember this guy, the Rainbow Man? He was a guy in the 80s or 90s or something who decided that he wanted to become famous. And sounds like everyone in 2021. And he decided that what he was going to do was he was going to go wherever television cameras were and get on camera with a rainbow wig on and give the thumbs up or the A-OK sign. And I gotta tell you, I've heard worse plans than that. And so he did it for a couple years, and he did such a good job that he ended up being featured on a Budweiser beer commercial. And he wanted to be more famous though. But then something happened in his life. He was sitting in this hotel room and he was watching Christian television, and the person on Christian television was talking about John 3:16, and he chose at that moment, he says that he chose to give his life to Christ. And then he was like, so what do I do now that I've been pursuing fame, but now I have this different agenda or mission in life? He decided that he was going to keep doing the same thing, but just write John 3:16 on himself. So that's when he got this t-shirt that says John 3:16 on it, and that's when he started holding up that yellow sign, if you remember, that said John 3:16. He'd go to sporting events and sit as close as he could to the front where the cameras were pointed, and he would hold up this sign. And it worked. He was actually drawn into an episode of The Simpsons. And on Saturday Night Live, they had a character based on him that was played by Christopher Walken. It worked. And he became a part of pop culture, which is what he was trying to do. The only problem was that presumably he didn't actually believe the words that were written in the verse that he was pushing forward so much. Because the part of the story that most people don't tell is the Rainbow Man kidnapped a woman and barricaded himself in a Los Angeles hotel room and started telling people that he was going to be shooting planes out of the sky at the Los Angeles airport. And so the story takes kind of a dark turn when you recognize the fact that the guy knew the words of the verse, but potentially was just missing something. Just knowing what God says doesn't mean you're going to get to heaven. Did you know that? Because this guy knew the most iconic verse better than anybody else. He built his entire career, if you could call it that, propagating and pushing out this verse to as many people as possible. He knew that verse better than anybody else, and it didn't change him. And I'm not trying to judge him, just saying that we've seen what he did. It did not change him, because just knowing the words of John 3:16 doesn't mean that you get to heaven. In fact, I had quite a moment when I was praying and realized that there are people in hell right now who know the words to this verse. So what does that mean? It means that you need to learn the difference between knowing something and believing something. That's what I want to talk to you about today. Our streets and our lives and our jobs and even our churches can be full of people who know John 3:16 but don't believe it. I want to talk to you about the difference between those two things today and what it would look like to make that choice. John 3:16 is what literary critics call a pericope, which means that it's a verse that's a part of a narrative, but people usually just quote the specific verse. They don't know the whole narrative of the story. And the whole narrative is pretty interesting. It's basically Jesus versus one of his arch enemies. Jesus did have enemies, and you would think that Jesus' enemies would be the same as the enemies of Christians, but they weren't. Jesus' enemies were the religious people, the people that were working in the synagogues, and they were called Pharisees. Jesus was constantly telling stories about them, mocking them, and it used to get them really upset. They were actually the people who ended up killing him. And one of the Pharisees in John chapter 3 came to Jesus in the middle of the night, and he asked him a question, kind of like the question we're talking about today. Like, our question is, how do you get to heaven? His question was like, Jesus, like, who are you? And it's interesting that he went in the middle of the night, this Pharisee. His name was Nicodemus, because Jesus stood in the temple every single day and talked to people and talked about God and talked about the kingdom of God and faith. And this guy was so religious, and the religious people that were in his group were so afraid of what Jesus was and the fact that he was subverting their religion that he had to go in the middle of the night to talk to him. Imagine that, being a church leader and being afraid to talk to Jesus in daylight. And so he goes to Jesus and he's like, dude, like, who are you? And Jesus does this thing that he does all the time that I love. He just doesn't answer the question or even really acknowledge it. He says, you have to be born again, which is awesome. But we hear it through the lens of, like, we've heard cheesy Christians say born again, like, I love Chick-fil-A and I got to be born again. I'm a Christian. But that's the lens that we hear it through. But it's quite an intense statement to say to someone, you have to be born a second time. And Nicodemus was really kind of offended or confused by this statement, because he's like, so what am I supposed to do? Crawl back into my mother's womb and be born a second time? Which is kind of like a lame attempt to satire Jesus. And Jesus just totally owns him. He says, are you the teacher of Israel and you don't even know these things? Like, if I was one of the disciples and I was there, I'd be like, oh. Are you the teacher of Israel and you don't even know these things? And then he says back to Jesus, help me understand. Jesus says, you're born twice. The first time you're born of water, the second time you're born of spirit. If you've ever seen a baby be born, it's quite an experience. It's very intense. There's a lot of fluid involved, and that's what Jesus is talking about. You're born once physically, and you're born once spiritually, and the two things are not the same thing. They're similar, though, in the aspect that you are born. You are starting a new and a different life. And he's saying to the guy, religion isn't being born again. A set of man-made rules isn't being born again. You have to be reborn spiritually. This is how you get to heaven. And then he quotes the iconic verse to him. He says, because God loved the world so much that he gave his only son, and he's the one talking, that anyone, even you religious, scared man, even you, anyone who believes in him will never die, but will live forever. He said to the religious man, you know everything, but you don't believe. See, the Pharisees knew everything. I don't know how many Bible verses you have memorized. The Pharisees, to even become a Pharisee, had to memorize the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy. They had to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible even to become a Pharisee word for word. That's 80,000 words that they had to memorize. And they had the first 5 books of the whole Bible memorized word for word, and he couldn't even tell that God was standing right in front of him. Knowing isn't believing. They're just not the same thing. And that really is the word that's the center of the verse, isn't it? Because when you look at John 3:16, really the only verse that has to do with us and what we can do is the word believe. God so loved the world, that's what he does, that he gave his only son, that's what he does, that whoever believes, that's what we can do, will never die but live forever. That's what God does when we believe. That word believe really is something in there, isn't it? And it's crazy when you look at John 3:16. I have 2 sons. I have a son named Ezra who's 5 and a son named Julian who's 2, and I love them so much. And I don't think you have to have a son to understand John 3:16. I just think that I didn't understand it until I had a son, because I used to think that what John 3:16 was talking about would you sacrifice someone for everyone? Like, would you sacrifice a person for all the people? Because I think everybody would do that, right? Like, if you were forced with a gun to your head to push a button, sacrifice one person or sacrifice all the people, I think pretty much everybody would be like, okay, I can do this. I can sacrifice this one person in exchange for the life of everyone. But that isn't what happened, and that isn't what God did. He didn't sacrifice a person, he sacrificed the person. And when I had my son Ezra, I started realizing how ridiculous of a thing this is to do, because I would never do it. Like, I love you guys, but if someone made me choose between all of you and my son, I would push my son and it wouldn't be a hard choice for me. I'm sorry, that's just what I would do. If I was in a stadium full of people and they were the coolest and best looking and smartest people in the world, and they were like, pick between your son and all these people, I'd be like, see ya. Nice not knowing ya. Hope you're going to heaven. Boom. It's not a hard choice to make. I would choose my son. God did something that I would never do, that no one would ever do, that you would never do. He gave up his only son so that you would have the opportunity not to know, but to believe. That word really is something, isn't it? Believe. It's an interesting word. I want to talk to you a bit about what it is and what it's not. You know, in the Bible, there's this word called faith. I'm sure you're familiar with this word. But faith is interesting because faith can only be a noun. Like, take love, for example. Love can be a noun or a verb. Like, I am in love with my wife. That's a noun. I love my wife. That's a verb. But faith can't be that. You can't, like, faith someone. Like, I saw a guy in the street and I faithed him. That doesn't work. It's just not a word. The word can't be a verb. When the word faith in Greek, which is the original language the Bible was written in, becomes a verb, that word is believe. When faith moves from being a noun to a verb, that's what belief is. It's the act of faith in action. So what is belief not? I got a little list for you here that I think will help you. Number 1, belief is not intellectual consent. Belief is not intellectual consent. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of things that you know that you don't believe because you don't do them. Like, for example, I know that if I lift weights every day, I will be cut. Now, I mean, look at me. Do I know that or do I believe that? I just know it. Because if I believed it, then you would be even vaguely intimidated by me. But you're not. The difference between knowing and believing is the difference between faith and faith in action. Everybody knows that diet and exercise are good, and the people who believe it are the people who do it. You aren't believing it when you're doing it, but you do it because you believe it. Belief is not intellectual consent. And God forbid that anybody would come to church for their whole life and think that because they think Jesus is real, they're going to heaven. That's not how it works. And then the second thing belief is not hope. I hope something's going to happen. I'm from Chicago, and the city is made of millions and millions of blue-collar men who cheer for the Bears and effectively are masochists. And every year, at the beginning of the year, they say, I believe the Bears are going to win the Super Bowl. And must be rough to be married to that guy, I'll tell you what. My nephew called me on the phone. He said, Uncle Landon, are you still a Bears fan now that you moved to Arizona? I said, no, because I don't hate myself enough. I don't like the feeling of pain. And every season, at the beginning of the season, Bears fans, it's true in a lot of cities, New York Giants fans, people do it. They say, I believe that this team is going to win. But that's not what the word believe means. They don't actually mean that they believe that. They mean that they hope that the team is going to win. And forgive me, but time and time again, they are proven wrong. And it's just a misapplication of the word. And just because you think Jesus is real, and just because you hope that what you were taught as a kid is going to come true, does not mean that you believe it. Belief is faith in action. What decisions have you made that you would not have made if you didn't believe in Jesus? What promise of God has caused you to make a choice that you would not have made if you did not know those words? What money have you spent differently because you know Jesus that you would not have spent that way if you did not know him? These are evidences of belief. What type of choices have you made in your sexual life that you absolutely would not have made? Or the flip of it, what choices have you not made that you absolutely would have made if you did not believe in Jesus? These are evidences of the fact that you believe. The actions are not belief, but the actions are evidence that the belief has taken place. Does that make sense? That's what belief is. And to illustrate it even further, or maybe even more clearly, I read this really great story about this tightrope walker named the Great Blondin. We have a picture of him we're going to show you. And entertainment was pretty light like 100 years ago. So people would go and watch this guy, and he would walk on a tightrope. It's kind of cool. I mean, the basic pitch is like, hey, let's go see if this guy dies. And they go see this guy, and he was really good, the Great Blondin, and he tightrope walked across Niagara Falls, which if you've never been there is just a massive place. And people were amazed, and he was really famous. And he said after he tightrope walked across Niagara Falls, I'm gonna do it again, but this time I'm gonna do it with a wheelbarrow with a human person in it. And everyone was like, this I gotta see. So at Niagara Falls, there was a ton of people waiting for the Great Blondin to walk across Niagara Falls with a person in his wheelbarrow. The day of the stunt, at a bar near Niagara Falls, two men were arguing. This is a real story, you can look it up. Two men were arguing about whether or not he could do it. One guy was like, no chance. The guy in the wheelbarrow will move around and he'll knock him off and they'll fall. No way. The other guy was like, I've seen him amaze me before and I've seen him amaze me again, and I believe that he can do it. And in the corner of the restaurant stood up the Great Blondin himself and said, I'm glad that you believe in me because I need someone to get in the wheelbarrow. And if he got in, he believed. And if he did not, he did not. You see the difference? If he got in, he believed. If he did not, he hoped. He thought. He maybe. That's the difference between believing and not believing. And belief is the center of the Gospel of John. In fact, 99 times in the book of John, it says the word believe. All throughout the book, it says these people believed in him, many believed in him. You can read the book and underline it every single time it says believe. 99 times in the book, it says that someone believed in Jesus. I think that they did that so that the 100th time would be the person reading it when they said, I believe. And I want to give you a chance to do that right now. We still have a bit of time left in the service. I'm going to give people an opportunity to pray. And I'm also going to talk about assurances of salvation, how you can know that you already have this if you do. And if you're new here, or if you're unsaved, or if whatever, you might be wondering, well, why are we talking about this? Isn't this just for the people that aren't Christians? But see, that's just the thing. People that have this, people that believe, they love talking about this. This is their favorite thing to talk about, because this is the thing they treasure the most. And they're hoping and praying right now that you choose the same choice that they made. I want to give you an opportunity to say that you believe. Just because you say it doesn't mean it's real, but if you don't say it, it certainly is not. Here's how you do it. You don't even have to close your eyes or bow your head. You can just pray, whether you're in the room or online right now. You can just pray this: God, I'm a sinner. God, I've broken your law. I need Jesus. I believe. It's that simple. God, I'm a sinner. God, I've broken your law. I need Jesus. I believe. And if you're here and you prayed that, or if you are at home and you prayed that, watching anywhere in the country or around the world, I would like to encourage you to text yes to 21999. And the reason for that is because becoming a Christian is very simple, but following Jesus is very complicated. The way in is very simple. You just believe in Jesus, but doing a good job of it is really hard. And that's why we're here. We're trying to figure it out together, how to follow Jesus well, and we want to help you in that journey. If you prayed that prayer, I would encourage you to text yes to 21999. That'd be great. And I hear a lot of messages about this type of thing, and I've done a lot of messages about this, but I have not heard a lot of messages about what I'm going to talk about next to close us out, which is how the people that already have this can know that they have it. One of the most common questions that Christians ask is, how can I know that I am saved? Like, I went to a camp, I raised my hand, I believed, I texted yes to a number, and that's awesome. And heaven rejoices every single time that happens. You start a party in heaven when a person gets saved. That's real, and that actually literally happens. But how can I know here on earth that that has physically taken place? Has anybody ever wondered that before? Go ahead and raise your hand. If you're at home, you can raise your hand too. This section over here is quite a bit more honest than the rest of them. How can I know that I'm saved? Well, the same guy that wrote John also wrote a book later in the New Testament called 1 John. And the whole point of 1 John is to give you an assurance of your salvation. If you're saved, it tells you how to know that you know that you know that this has taken place. And so I've taken the book of John and I've talked about here, I'm going to tell you the 3 things that they repeatedly say in the book of John for how you can know that you know that you know that you're saved. We think linearly. That's the way movies and books are written for most English people. The Jewish way of thinking is cyclically, and they would repeat the same ideas over and over and over again. So what you see in the book of 1 John is you see 3 cyclical ideas that are repeated to emphasize this idea, and I'll just give it to you now so you can understand. How do I know that I'm saved? Well, the book of John says 10 times that people that are saved are obedient to Christ. That's one of them. They listen to Jesus. They do the things that Jesus says. Jesus says, love your enemies, they do it. Jesus says, give to the poor, they do it. Jesus says this, Jesus says that, they do it. They obey him. It's like the basest level of following Jesus. And for those of us who have believed, we see this happening in our life. And in 1 John it says, I obey Jesus and his commandments are not burdensome. The longer that you follow Jesus, the longer that you believe, the easier it gets to follow Jesus. I'm not saying you don't have doubts. I'm not saying you don't have concerns or questions or fears. We have all of those things, but you do obey him. And the problem is that some Christians, they pray a prayer and they say they obey Jesus. They don't obey Jesus, and then they're like, something's wrong with Jesus. No, nothing's wrong with Jesus. Something's wrong with you and the fact that you didn't actually believe. And the second one is this, obedience to Christ and then overcoming sin. We see this all throughout the book of 1 John, that people who follow Jesus, people who believe, they become overcomers of sin. They break the chains of addiction. They used to use drugs, they don't anymore. They used to watch pornography every day, they don't anymore. I'm not saying they don't struggle with anything. I'm not saying they never sin. You know, Lord knows, ask my wife, I'm not perfect. But I will say that we are overcomers of sin. And the problem is people say that they believe and they don't overcome sin. And then they say, oh, there's something wrong with Christianity. No, there's not anything wrong with Christianity. I love you, but you just didn't believe. Because people who believe become overcomers of sin. It's awesome. There are people who have sat in church for 20 years and have never overcome a sin. I love you so much, you need to ask God if you've really believed in him. Good God, if you've never overcome a single sin, ask the Lord if you've ever really truly believed in Jesus, because those who do become overcomers of sin. And then the third one, obedience to Christ, overcoming sin, and what's the third one? I forget. There it is. Love for other Christians. And this one's hard for me because I love Christians, I just don't always like them. You're trying to talk to them and they're like, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned. And you're just like, oh, okay. But it doesn't mean that you like everybody. It certainly doesn't mean that you like everybody who's a professing Christian. The Pharisees would have been professing Christians, and Jesus was exceptionally rude and subversive to them. What it does mean is that the people who have Jesus, the people who have the Holy Spirit, as you go through life, you sense an increasing kinship with them and an increasing love. It doesn't mean that every person who takes on the banner of Christian, you're just like, you're my best friend. It means that the people who really have him, you sense an increasing and a growing love for those people. And that is a truly joyous experience. And that's why people go to church for a lifetime, because they just like the people, because they love Jesus, and so do they. And so if these three things are in your life, and they are in your life in an increasing way, that is one of the ways that you can know that you know that you know that you have it. And if you don't, there's nothing wrong with Jesus, there's nothing wrong with Christianity. You should examine the center of John 3:16. Have you actually believed? You know? That's what I came over here to tell you guys this morning. Would you pray with me? God, thank you for today. Thank you for the angels rejoicing in heaven for people who are saved. I really believe that that's actually happening right now, and I take joy in that, and I take part in that. I pray for people who have weak faith, and it's hard for them to make this jump. Give them the gift of faith in action. We cannot generate that out of our bodies. We cannot generate that out of our minds. But if you give us that gift, we can put it into action. And I pray for every single person who's leaning in by faith and saying, I choose to believe. Remind them again of the great joy of salvation, of the great joy of obeying Christ, of the great joy of overcoming sin, and of the fact that they are destined for heaven, that their destiny is in heaven. And that cannot be altered or changed or taken away or stolen or reduced or rusted or destroyed. That this thing that we have is never ending and never changing. And I just pray for that. And also pray for anybody who's skeptical and they're watching and they're like, how do I know? I pray that you would help them to just dive in and try. If we're all wrong, then we're all wrong. But what if we're all right? Would you bless them with that, God? I pray against the enemy snatching away any seeds that have been planted today. So we're praying this now by faith in Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks so much, Pastor Landon. There is a God who knows you, who sees you, and who loves you. And if you haven't said yes to him yet, our prayer is that you would. Again, just text yes to 21999. In this moment, later today, later this week, there is always a moment and a time to say yes to God. If you came here today and you need prayer, if you're here online and you need prayer, you can come down front here in the room, and online you can text prayer to 21999. We'd love to pray with you about anything you've got going on. To be able to walk alongside you is a gift as we journey this life together, pursuing Christ with one another. Thanks so much for being here with us. We'll see you next weekend.